Well, you can believe after that arduous move from from Virginia to Texas, and dealing with loading and unloading that truck, I had no nostalgic feelings about returning to Virginia anytime soon. Well, thank you, Madam Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters and guests. Family planning. It's a rather innocuous word here in the United States. There might be some currents in there. But in China, family planning can be cruel and brutal in its implementation. It can be damaging to Chinese society, and it can be perilous to Asia and the wide world. In 1979, China had the world's largest population at just fewer than 1 billion people. Now, even for a country the size of China, 1 billion people were a lot. Now, by comparison, the United States, as estimated by the Census Bureau, was just slightly less than a quarter of that, at about 222 million people. So China's growing population was an on-again, off-again issue with the communist government. At one point, it was considered great to have a large population. Then a shift in perspective, and a rapidly growing population was considered an impediment to their plans for development and industrialization. So the government had tried over the years various types of family planning with no long-term impact. And many of those times, the programs were ignored, or they got caught up by other events, such as the chaotic Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1961, and the tumultuous Cultural Revolution that took place from 1966 to 1976. But by 1979, the government, having become more stable, and with growing concern about the increasing populace of the country, started a new program. And this one was focused around a temporary one-child policy. Now, I say temporary, but to this day, the one-child policy is the anchor of the government's efforts to try and control the population of the people. Now, as its name implies, the government encouraged families to have just one child. They did this through positive incentives as well as coercive measures. If you adhered to the program, you could enjoy better housing, you could be available for better employment opportunities, you could have better salaries, amongst other benefits. But if you went against the policy, you were subjected to substantial fines, you could lose your job, you could be ostracized by your community, and you could be subjected to forced sterilization and abortions. So the policy was easily corrupted because of the tremendous pressure they put on the local communities to implement the one-child policy's quotas. Nonetheless, it was a tragically successful program. Now, the Chinese government estimates that since the inception of the program in 1979, the one-child policy has prevented the birth of some 250 million people. And it has slowed the rate of growth in China to such a point that they expect by 2050 that China will be in a negative population growth. But there's a cost. The one-child policy promotes social instability by creating an unhealthy male-to-female ratio. And because of Chinese culture's favoritism of boys over girls, families, when faced with giving birth to a female, might send their child out to the rural areas to live with relatives, abandon them to an orphanage, or engage in gendercide through sex selection abortions. Now, a 2009 British medical journal study found that because of gendercide, some 37 million Chinese men will not be able to marry because their future wives had been terminated in the womb. Now, the normative male-to-female ratio is 105 boys to 100 girls at birth. In China, at the end of the last decade, their ratio was somewhere near 114 boys to 100 girls at birth. Now, this disparity in the natural male-female ratio is responsible for increased human trafficking and sexual slavery, and is considered a causative factor in increased violent crimes. Also in China, just like Western societies, they're becoming an age society with a diminishing workforce, yet a growing number of people depending on that workforce. So this is going to put tremendous pressure on the labor force as they try to be competitive in our world today, and also seriously strain the social network. Now, in Chinese census reports that in the inception of the program, the fertility rate in China was about 2.91 babies per child, babies per woman. And they estimate that in 2012, it's fallen down to 1.55 babies per woman, which is well below the 2.1 value needed for a stable population. So the Chinese government is confronted with a conundrum. What do? They're still very much concerned about their growing population, and they're worried that if they abandon the one-child policy, they're going to have uncontrolled growth. But at the same time, they recognize that a combination of the one-child policy with the cultural disposition of favoritism towards boys is putting their social system at risk. So buoyed by the success of the program, they're now trying to figure out how they can confront the socio-economic crisis that is about to befall them. Madam President.